Hello, welcome to another Geotech Hour. I'm your host, Dr. David Bray, inaugural director for the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center. And today on March the 10th, 2021, we're going to be looking at the future ahead and the long-term future, particularly looking at the years of 2025, 2035, 2045 even, which is almost 25 years into the future. Now, to do so, though, we're going to recognize that this date, March the 10th, 2021, represents the eve of the Geotech Center, which launched a year ago on March the 11th, 2021, which happened to be the same day that COVID-19, later that afternoon, was declared a pandemic, and we had to address the challenges we would face with this virus. Obviously, a lot has happened since then. We've dealt with the challenges of both the pandemic itself, its impact on societies and economies, but also changes not just in the United States, but around the world with how governments and societies operate, the role of companies in shaping that future, and ultimately questions about where do we want to go in this world together. Here at the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center, we firmly believe we're in a world in which technology and data are disproportionately changing how the world operates. That's impacting societies, the world, geopolitics, and we call this a geotech decade. Now, again, it's worth, as we look to the future, to consider the past that we have encountered. If 2001 to 2011 was an era in which we experienced, unfortunately, the tragedy of 9/11, followed by other events as well, impacting around the world with counterterrorism, counterinsurgencies, and activity in Iraq and Afghanistan, in which the US and other entities were involved, and questions about how do we deal with increasingly a world in which individuals are being super empowered to do good, but also in some cases being super empowered to do things that are harmful or hurtful to the planet and the world that we operate, and the role in which non-state entities intersect with nation-state entities in geopolitics. That was the decade of 2001 to 2011. Fast forward then to 2011 to 2021, the decade that just preceded where we are now. This was a decade that began, at least in the United States, with hope in government, the idea that big tech was going to help lift us into a better future. These were fairly heady years that if you look at then what happened over the next decade, unfortunately, we had a decline in hope and challenges in terms of questions about the role of government, the role of the nation state, how do we avoid surveillance state, and then ultimately also questions about how do we avoid surveillance capitalism, the role of big tech as well. Fundamental questions that are now addressing us as we look here now on March the 10th, 2021, at what we call the geotech decade ahead, where the very technologies that were developed 20 or 30 years ago in some cases that were only available to large nation states increasingly are being democratized and are now available to organizations, to companies, but also to individuals, raising fundamental questions about the choices we humans will make on how we want to use these tools. The video that you're about to see is a conversation that was actually had on the anniversary, the 74th anniversary of the United Nations on UN Charter Day. Now, in this anniversary with UN Charter Day happened back on June 26, 2019, before the pandemic, it was an ask of them to have a conversation about what would 2045 look like and how would AI, the internet, and changing advances in technologies shape the future of the world and how we govern, how we collaborate. Would there still be a United Nations, for example? Would nation states still matter? And these are all questions that I think in the decade ahead we will have to face. Because in this geotech decade, it is not certain that at the end of the decade, we will see open societies thriving as opposed to, unfortunately, those that are more autocratic or dictatorial regimes. Again, the choices we humans make will shape the decade ahead. At the end of the geotech decade, it is not clear even if nation states are the right things to be talking about or if other influencers in our lives, whether they be networks, whether they be corporations, or some sort of ideology that transcends the planet, really are things that we should be talking about. Because if there's anything that's certain, it is that we humans continue to change how we use tools, how tools change what we can do, and in return that changes how we shape what we do, how we govern, and we are being asked to work together to collaborate and govern at speeds heretofore unprecedented in the history of the planet. As we look towards the future ahead, the long-term future of 2025, 2035, 2045, and how technology will shape it, one thing is certain, we will be a planet that will have to ask the question about where do we fundamentally, not just as humans, but as life on this planet, this pale blue dot that we all know, where do we want to go? So I hope you will enjoy the conversation ahead as we look at the eve of the Geotech Center at the future. I would also call attention that we will have another special Geotech Hour on Thursday, March the 11th, 2021, at again the normal time from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern. That's 9 to 10 a.m. Pacific. Obviously, the video will be available for re-airing as well, but that special one on Thursday will be a conversation where I'll be joined by Vint Cerf, Melissa Flagg, President Shirley N. Jackson of RPI, and former Congressman Mike Rogers of Michigan, who was also chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, for a robust conversation as we look to the geotech decade ahead. What trends do we want to be seeing? What things do we want to actually help move forward? The future we want to create. And so I hope you'll join me as well for that special Geotech Hour, recognizing that right now what we will be focusing on today on March 10th on the eve of the Geotech Center is the future that we are considering as we look towards the future ahead.
So we're here to talk today about where will we be in 2045. As mentioned, that's 26 years from now, when hopefully the UN is celebrating its 100 years anniversary, and we're looking at a world that ideally is more inclusive, more equitable, and prosperous for us all. Now, first I would say it's been said that there's two ways to predict the future. One is where you actually feed a whole lot of algorithms and data and try to analyze the trends to guess where that's going to go. The other way is to do either Ouija boards, horoscopes, or crystal ball, but in either way, you're probably going to be wrong. So I will first caveat and say these are my efforts to try and trace the contours of the choices that we have before us now that involve these technologies, but also most importantly involve people. Because at the end of the day, it is about all of us as people as to where we might be able to go and where we may want to try to avoid going in the next 26 years ahead. Now, as already mentioned, 1945, the UN Charter was signed. It's interesting to note, and I think, can we put up my slides, possibly? Oh, good, excellent, thank you. And I just want to make sure, so when the UN Charter was signed, it's worth recalling that Germany and the war in Europe had just ended 6 weeks earlier. That's how soon after those events that the UN Charter was signed, and it wouldn't be for another 7 weeks before war in the Pacific would end. So in some respects, the war was still going on when that occurred. And it's worth noting because that's a very pivotal moment. Now, here in the United States, The Nation, a publication, actually assessed that what the people of the world want is something that will not mirror their conflicts, but resolve them. Something that will despair their fears and will satisfy their hopes. I share that because I think that is very much true now in 2019 as well. We're increasingly seeing a world that seems to be becoming fragmented, becoming what some may refer to as being more tribal or more insular, as well as increasingly polarized. And I would say it's happening because we're not meeting those hopes as well as we could. And unfortunately, we're allowing fears to start filling the space. Now, on that second part, however, they said, this desire cannot be the nature of things fulfilled, which was interesting. They said that it actually requires nations to achieve integration and internal maturity before they can create a world organization that itself is mature. So this is worth thinking about because it's worth considering where we are now in 2019. Have we seen all nations mature? Have we seen maybe some slide backwards? Have we seen possibly failed nation states? And is that then a challenge for the United Nations to bring together a world? Because until we address those national issues, we may have challenges addressing those international issues. Something to consider as we put forward going forward. Now, on the technology side, events happened since 1945. Starting in 1969, there was all of 6 nodes on what was called the ARPANET in the American Southwest. Fast forward to 1982, the United States is beginning to get connected with connections of this ARPANET, as well as the Pacific and Atlantic connections. 1993, Europe and the United States are getting heavily connected, as is the rest of the world, but this is still pre-World Wide Web. How many people remember what used to be called Archie or Gopher protocols? I'm glad we have some people in the room. For those of you who never used this, imagine trying to access the internet through a text-based interface. That was Archie and Gopher protocols. This was pre-World Wide Web. This was pre-Netscape Navigator. Fast forward to 2007, they gave up actually trying to draw borders of countries to map the connections that made up the internet. And by the time you fast forward to 2014, they gave up even trying to draw the internet connections on a geographical map. So this is another thing that's also happening that has been challenging the world we're going into, which is, where's a packet of information on the internet? Is this where it's sent from, received by? We've recently seen with GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, that is an effort to apply rules involving data privacy and technology outside your geographical borders. It'll be interesting to see what happens, but that raises huge questions about the sovereignty of the nation state, as well as where we're going as a world ahead. Now, 2019, we are here now. In some respects, great news story. For most of the world, child mortality is at a near low. We've seen an increase in prosperity, but there still have been things unmet, and with everything we solved, there are, of course, new challenges to be resolved. First, globalization has not benefited everyone. Unfortunately, when the economics and the policymakers were coming together, what they didn't say is globalization does not happen all at once in terms of rising all boats at once. Especially if you're in countries with strong currencies, your country's more rural and manufacturing populations will have to wait until the currencies of other nations are equally lifted up for globalization to have a benefit. We're seeing this in the United States, we're seeing this in Europe. I was a Marshall Fellow last year to Europe, had a conversation with a head of a major bank in England who said, if there's anything we can learn from Brexit, we didn't ask enough of the rural populations before we went to the vote. The same thing might be said about what's happening in the United States as well. The heartland is saying, wait, we haven't even benefited from the computer revolution. Why should we sign up for a revolution that involves artificial intelligence or automation? And so then we're starting to see a fear of the unknown, fear of the strangers, a nostalgia, whether it's real or false, for an era in which these things were not present because they have not seen all the benefits lift them up. This is not just a Western phenomenon. We can also be seeing this in other parts of the world as well. But I raise this because if there's anyone to start having the conversation about the fact that globalization has not benefited everyone, it should be the United Nations. Second, the good news about the internet, anyone can print whatever they want. The bad news about the internet, anyone can print whatever they want. This has created challenges because print subscriptions have declined dramatically. By some estimates, more than 80 to 90% than what they were 15 years ago. At the same time, digital subscriptions haven't picked up to take up that loss in revenue. And what happens when you have a loss in revenue in the media industry? It's all about trying to capture your attention. So the loss of subscription revenue is correlated to a return to sensationalism, and this is not new. We had this happen in the United States in the 1890s. You may have remembered a phrase, remember the Maine. Unfortunately, that did not have good results as to where that went. But I raise that because we act as if this is some new phenomenon and we're not sure where it came from, when in fact, unfortunately, it is a consequence of we're no longer paying for subscriptions to our news, therefore it's become an advertising model, and thus it's become what can get you to pay attention and share your story with others. Any guesses as to the number one way to make something go viral on the internet? Any guesses? Make it angry. Second way to make something go viral on the internet, make it fearful. Now, you don't want to make everybody angry or fearful, because if you make everybody angry or fearful, it quickly dies out. Everybody agrees and they move on. What you really want to do is make it so that one group is angry, and the other group is angry in response to that group, and it cross-pollinates back and forth. So we are seeing a product of where the technology is incentivizing the wrong behaviors, which is the delivery of news that makes you angry or fearful will result in more ad revenue, and thus don't be surprised if that's what's delivered to you. Again, something for the United Nations to address. It probably will have to be addressed individually by individual nations, but if we can begin to wrap our arms around this global problem, given the global internet, that may be something that can create a better future if we starting the discussions now as we head to 2045. Lastly, technology has super-empowered individuals. As already mentioned, almost all of us have a smartphone. Does anyone not have a smartphone and wants to say they don't have a smartphone? Just curious. According to some, you have more power than NASA actually had in terms of computational power when it went to the moon more than 50 years ago with that smartphone of yours. You think about it, it's an ability to actually not only communicate in real time anywhere in the world, you can do video, you have GPS, you have all these great capabilities. You can call a car, you can reserve a hotel, all through your pocket. But at the same time, these same technologies can be used for disruption as well. Unfortunately, there are examples. I come from the world of bioterrorism preparedness and response. I did that for 5 years, starting in 2000. And it was interesting. I signed up in 2000 at the Centers for Disease Control's Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program in the United States. And about every 6 months, we said we didn't need to. We were told by different officials that we didn't need to exist. The Cold War was supposedly over. And it was scheduled for September 11th, 2001, weeks in advance, that I was going to give a briefing as to what we would do technology-wise if a bad day occurred. 8:34, the world changed. That briefing was canceled. We piled computers into cars, and we dealt with the response to 9/11. Didn't sleep for 3 weeks, stood down on October 1st. October 3rd, I ended up giving that briefing as to what we would do if a bioterrorism event happened. And unfortunately, 24 hours later, the first case of anthrax showed up in the United States. Technology, for good and for bad, is allowing people to do things that were only possible by nation states 40 or 50 years ago. That includes areas of what technology in the cyber realm allows you to do, technology in the bio realm, which could easily be a conversation for another day. We have to face the reality that we are super empowering people to do both good and bad. And we have to recognize, how do you live in a world in which that's possible? According to both the UK Health Authority as well as the National Institutes for Health in the United States, between 1% to 2% of people in the world are psychopaths, meaning they do not have the same emotional response to hurting another human being that most of us would have. Now, fortunately, I would say the people present in this room are a non-random distribution, so I don't think we need to be too worried. But if that's the case where we're 7.6 billion people on the planet, that does mean we're going to face a world of between 80 to 160 million people that will not have the same emotional response to hurting other human beings. You mentioned the atrocities that we saw in the 1940s and why the UN was created. Now again, it's not to say that that's necessarily all bad. You don't want your surgeon to break down in emotional distress during their surgery with you. But it's recognizing that if we're super empowering people, we've got to recognize that not all humans have the same empathy towards their fellow human beings. And what can we do as a world together to possibly address that and possibly increase empathy around the world? So, we're seeing tensions. I'm first going to address open societies and then briefly closed societies, but we're seeing tensions emerge in open societies related to the ripple effects of technologies. And these ripple effects are creating disagreements over how we deal with corporations and firms, how we deal with trade, and how we deal with immigration. The first one is we're seeing tensions where some groups want global libertarianism. They basically do not want to have governments around the world play a heavy role. This is nonpartisan. This actually splits across different partisan divides. But there is an increasing movement that doesn't want people to have government regulation of the internet, does not want to have government regulation of monetary policy. Just a few days ago, Facebook announced, of course, its own currency. That's another example of this trend. Second, progressive localism. There are some that say, forget about the nation state. It's all about the local community, whether you do it at the city level or the community level. That nations really are just middlemen or middle individuals that add no value between the global activities and the local activities of my community. There's both good and bad with this. In some respects, working on the local level, you can be more aware of the needs of your people. But how do we deal with hard issues like climate change, where you cannot address that just locally? It requires all of us. There's national protectionism. Unfortunately, this is on the rise in Europe, in the United States, and other places around the world, where there's a desire to return back to building, whether you call them walls, fences, and invoke them both physically as well as economically, and result in tensions that say revert back to building higher walls and borders. This may be a response to the fourth trend, which was global neoliberalism, which has probably been the prevalent paradigm that most of the world has been following for the last 25 years. The belief that if you open up markets, you reduce barriers to trade, you have an inclusive, competitive world society, that would lift everybody up. But as already mentioned, unfortunately, globalization has not met those ideals yet. There are parts of the world, countries around the world, that are not feeling like free trade has benefited them. There are people seeing their way of life be eroded, partly through opening up of markets, but also partly because as technology advances with automation, with AI and robotics, those jobs no longer require 10,000 people to do the work. Instead, it only requires 50 people to do the same work. And then finally, national developmentalism. This is the idea that nations, instead of going in the direction of having an open attitude to trade and economics, should actually invest in their own people. But of course, that raises a big question, which is, if that's the case, how do we make sure nations think both about their own people, but also about the world as a whole? That we do not devolve into an us versus them. There have been some very classic experiments done in experimental economics where they take people that have worked together for 10 to 15 years, bring them into a room, and they randomly assign them beads based on color, blue versus red. They have them go into a different room for 20 minutes just to talk and socialize, blue on one side, red on the other. Then they come back and they say, we're going to give everybody in this room $20. You can keep the $20, you can bet a part of it, or you can bet it all. But whichever team bets the most will double their money. The other team gets nothing, and if there's a tie, nobody gets anything. What do you think happens? Here are groups that have worked together for 10 to 15 years. They convince themselves they're going to be more aggressive, more risk-taking than the other team, that the other team's going to wimp out, and of course they both bet it all, and nobody gets anything. We humans, as a result of our biology, for whatever reason, quickly identify affinity solely on the basis of bead color. That also happens with nations, that also happens with other ideologies. And we convince ourselves we must know more than the other side. This is a challenge we face because I would submit what we are facing as a world, as a United Nations, are the limits of human nature. And it took an event, unfortunately, like World War II, to bring us all together at that point in time. Of course, those in the room, we all know there are 30 human rights. The celebration of human rights happened 70 years ago, December of 1949, December 6th, actually. But ask the question, if we were trying to come together now as a world to agree on the same 30 human rights, do you think any of us would ever get it past our own national legislatures or executive branch? Do you think we would even be able to have a conversation and reach agreement here in the United Nations? So we think that we somehow have progressed since 1945, but I would say what's happening is we've forgotten how bad things can get. That losing that memory of World War II and what happened there is causing us to have this idea that maybe we don't need these protections, maybe we don't need to come together and put aside our own self-interest, and we can go it alone. So, closed societies, there are also tensions. I'm going to briefly highlight 3 of them as well. Closed societies are facing the need for taller walled gardens. As the world has, as a result, over the last 25 years, through globalization, become more connected, through the internet, and through increasing data transparency, this challenges closed societies, and their response is to build higher and taller walled gardens. There's also a tension to try and actually have increased stability controls, use of algorithms, use of biometrics, use of data to monitor everyone in their population, and to assign them scores, to actually track them and rank them. And unfortunately, this is a source of control because, of course, whoever sets the metrics sets the rewards and sets the disincentives. And then finally, some of them have said, maybe we actually need a completely new world order. On one hand, as already mentioned, what was agreed upon in 1945 was not all-inclusive. We missed out on an entire half of the human population and should have addressed that by including women as well as men in the conversation. But on top of that, the people that were there, that still wasn't everybody. It was not as inclusive as a conversation it could be. But again, going back to the challenge, which is seeking a new order could be both good, but if only a few get to set it, it might be even worse. So I raise that because you are seeing those that are not happy with the post-World War II order, and unfortunately that does include the United Nations here as well, and are seeking to disrupt it through other means. So, what's happening on the technology side that are exacerbating these tensions? Well, 2013 was a year we made history and we probably didn't even notice it. There was about 7.1 human beings on the planet and about 7.1 billion network devices on the planet as well. Not all of them connected to the internet, and obviously not all equitably distributed across the world, but the same number of network devices as there were humans. Any guesses as to how many network devices were on the planet just 2 years later in 2015? 14 billion. We doubled in just 2 years the number of network devices. Fortunately, we're not doing that with human populations. That would be problematic. But I raise that because that's not linear change, that is exponential change. We're now anywhere between 30 and 35 billion, and it's only going to continue that curve up. In terms of data, there's about 4 billion terabytes of data. To give you in perspective, there's some that say that the text holdings, just the text holdings, not everything else, but the text holdings of the US Library of Congress is about 10 terabytes. So I'm talking about 400 million versions of the text holdings of our Library of Congress in the United States. Now, not all of that's data worth viewing. Some of it's a lot of cat videos online as well. But it raises interesting questions about how are we going to make sense of all that data. Fast forward to 2025, less than 6 years into the future. Anywhere between 75 billion on up, some of the more aggressive estimates say 100 billion, 300 billion network devices on the face of the planet, relative to 8 billion human beings. Now, in December of last year, we finally hit the tipping point where there were now more than half the people on the planet connected to the internet. Now, that does mean we still have an obligation to, at least for those who want it, to have internet access, because we still have another half to address. But if current trends continue, and we'll see whether or not they continue or if they change, we're going to bring on about another 3 billion people in the next 6 to 7 years. Think about it. It took us about 35 years to get 3.5 billion people connected. We're going to do that again in about 6 or 7 years. That's going to challenge notions of cybersecurity, notions of privacy, making sure people aren't exploited in terms of their data or other attacks. We're already seeing an increase in ransomware targeting hospitals, local municipalities. There are going to be ripple effects that are going to be affected. And in terms of the number of people, ideally, we'll move forward. In terms of data, the data is going to continue to grow so that we're now looking at 200 billion terabytes relative to 4 billion in 2013. How many people go past the third or fourth pages of the search results? If you don't, you're probably missing out on things that are useful. I'm glad some people do. But it does raise the question that search by keyword will probably no longer work. And actually, just like how we think it's quaint that some people still have phones that have cords, probably our children are going to say, wait, you actually went to the machine and typed in what you were looking for? Because what they're going to be used to, especially by 2045, is a machine that's aware of the task you're doing. And it says to you, I see you're trying to do this task. Would it be useful if I provided this information to you? And you say yes or no. And while that sounds great, that also means the machine knows what you're doing. It means that those that don't choose to share what they're doing with the machine and share their data with the machine may be at a disadvantage in terms of literacy versus those who choose, which raises questions about how do we avoid either a surveillance state or how do we avoid surveillance capitalism. Just to give you another sense of the size of change that we are facing. Internet Protocol version 4. It's how we actually address several things over the last 20, 30 years on the internet. It's the 4 digits. We ran out of those numbers about 2 years ago. But there was about 4.3 billion addresses that we used, whether it was for web servers, FTP servers, anything on the internet. We ran out of those addresses 2 years ago, but that was the internet you knew. We're now moving to Internet Protocol version 6. Which instead of having 2 to the 32 has 2 to the 128th in terms of the number of numbers and addresses. But what is the corresponding size object? If the internet you knew, if you put those 4.3 billion numbers in a beach ball, what is the corresponding size object for the internet you will know? Any guesses? I heard moon. What if I told you the size of our sun? This is unprecedented human change. Probably the only time we've had anything near this was when they actually started doing printed books. And so I actually was thinking about when I got over to say, imagine trying to actually be asked to give a keynote as to how books will impact society. It's sort of the same idea, which is it's going to have a whole lot of changes. And any guesses as to how long after books were started, the printing press was created, the idea of the Treaty of Westphalia, the notion of organizing by geographical borders, how long afterwards did that occur? It took 200 years. But I raise that because this will probably create new ways of organizing that may or may not be based on geography, may or may not be based on physical borders. And the question is that going to be better or is it going to be worse? Are we going to see a return to neo-feudalism? That may sound a little outrageous, but look at social media where you have the people with the 1 million followers, those are the lords and ladies. You have the people with the 10,000 followers, those are the vassals, and the rest of us are serfs. There's also been talk about universal basic income. That may also be a way that actually sort of is a return to communism of some form, if that occurs as well. New ways of organizing will probably present themselves, whether they be ideological, whether they be network-based, whether they be tied to corporations. And that may be part of the frustration we're facing right now, is it's no longer just about nations. Laws, technologies, and narratives all shape how we distribute power. The laws you pass, the narratives you use, and now increasing with AI and other technologies like the internet, like advanced data and analytics, challenge how we distribute power, and that's creating tensions as well. And I would submit that we are missing right now a positive narrative of the future. We used to do world fairs. We still have them to a degree, but they're no longer the attraction of a visceral, tangible experience that people can go to where they see themselves in the future, and even if it's wrong. I mean, I'm supposed to be in a space station by now, right? But it's about trying to give a hopeful narrative that is inclusive for everybody. And so maybe that's something the United Nations could do, is reinvigorate visceral, tangible experiences that are hopeful as we shape forward. Because in the absence of those narratives, don't be surprised if dystopian narratives fill the void. Now, again, going back to what was written in 1945, they said that this could not occur until nations themselves are mature. But I'm going to actually submit, it's not about just having nations mature before you try to move forward as a global United Nations. It's also about making sure those global corporations are mature, as well as network communities. And what we may be seeing right now are there are some corporations that are a little less than mature than we thought they were. And that's creating tensions and challenges around the world. So what are the choices we face going into 2045? First, will technology continue to erode social cohesion? Going back to the ideal of libertarianism, I would submit at least fiat currencies require you to work together. If you remove fiat currencies, if you remove these saying that I need to actually use a common currency to interact with people, then you can imagine that you have different groups. You have an alt-left currency, you have an alt-right currency, and they no longer have to work together, and they've already had themselves create echo chambers in the news media. Now they start doing it on their currency basis, now they start doing it in terms of reputation basis. And lest this sound far-fetched, I already have had in the last year 2 conversations in Eastern Europe, won't name the countries, where there have been multiple times where there have been different partisan groups present that said, we're only having this conversation because you're here. When you leave, we will go back and we will not interact anymore. So we already have cases where technology has allowed different ideologies to become so extreme that they now see each other as adversaries or enemies, but they're attempting to coexist in the same physical space. And again, going back to the lessons of what happened in the 1940s, we know what happens when those tensions get too high, and it's not a good thing. Can we find a way in which humans can act locally and AI can help us think globally? I would submit for most of us, we can't think globally. Again, this is a non-random group of people in the room, but for most of human evolution, you ran into 80 people in your entire lifespan, and those were immediate family members for the most part. If you ask people to envision more than 150 faces in their mind, they probably can't do that. Cognitively, we are not designed to be aware of a world that is globally connected as the world we're faced. And that's, again, the limitation of human nature. But maybe if we find ways in which machine learning and AI can help us expand our perspectives. There have already been experiments where they have pen pals in different nations. The machine helps translate the language. You do this for about 9 months, 12 months, and then you reveal at the end of 9 to 12 months that that person who you have been a pen pal with, that you thought was speaking the same language as you, was actually someone of a different nationality, different background, and may have been someone that you would have normally perceived to be your adversary, but in fact, you've reached them and linked them together. We've got to use technology to overcome our own flaws as humans, and one of our flaws of humans is we cannot think globally well. Will a cognitive Cold War continue? I would submit right now there are multiple cognitive Cold Wars occurring around the world. It's not being covered too well. It's hard to actually attribute where this is occurring and who's doing it. But it's not something new. The reality is other nations have interfered with other nations in terms of information delivery and what they perceive to be truths for quite some time. But it's now even more possible with the reach that is possible through the internet and social media. And again, playing into the fact that we humans have limitations, unfortunately, we all have what's called confirmation bias. If something's delivered to you that sounds good, that matches your belief system, unfortunately, you will buy into it without a critical read of the actual article. And it's been shown that more facts will not change your position. Instead, they'll actually make you dig in more. Similarly, if you come out and want to say X is not true, we humans never remember the not part. We just remember the X part. We've seen this happen in the United States where a video of one of our rather famous congresspeople was posted that was obviously fake. But the question is, how do you address that in an open society? You take down the video, you've just done censorship. But you leave the video up, nobody remembers the disclaimer that says X is not true, they just remember X. So this is a huge question, which is our own human limitations as we become connected are playing into this cognitive war, this Cold War that is occurring. And it's only going to get worse as technology challenges our ability to actually perceive anything without being played into our biases. Will globalization's low tide, as already mentioned, if you're in a country with a strong currency, your manufacturing in rural areas are currently disadvantaged in a globalized world. Will that low tide continue to decimate rural areas? Just to give an example from the United States as a whole, 2 years ago, 47%, according to some sources, 47% of all the jobs created in the United States went to the top 10 cities only. 1 year later, 49.5% of all the jobs created in the United States went to the top 10 most populous cities only. So we're seeing this phenomenon, at least in terms of cities and job creation, it's a rich gets richer phenomenon. And the idea that somehow rural areas with a less of a challenge in terms of access, lower wage entry, it's not occurring. You see companies gravitating to where the workers already are, even if it's more expensive than going to rural areas. Which means something has to be done to replant that forest. It's almost like the Amazon, which is if you cut down Amazon trees, they don't automatically regrow back. You actually discover the Amazon itself is a desert if you cut down those trees. Whether it's done by governments, whether it's done by the private sector, whether it's done by academia or nonprofits, something has to be done to help these rural areas that are currently being decimated. Else we will have a challenge in terms of frustrated, upset people. And the answer is not everybody moves to the cities. At the same time these trends are happening in the United States, you're seeing mobility as a whole go down, especially in rural areas. People are being stuck in an area that is seeing their factories close and they aren't able to move someplace else. These are huge challenges that we have to address. And then lastly, can you balance national interests with ecological and environmental interests? That to me is a huge challenge because right now, whether it's a corporation or a nation, it's almost a prisoner's dilemma, which is unless you can guarantee no one is going to defect in the bargaining, you are motivated to not cooperate yourself. And we have not figured out a way to use technology that can both encourage national thinking, can encourage individual private sector thinking, but also address economic and ecological interests. And this is the fundamental tension, because we cannot, again, expect that everyone globally will somehow put aside their own self-interests. That's not human nature. It's even worse because if you're in societies right now that are not experiencing these environmental impacts, you walk outside and say, things seem pretty well. So maybe the technology can make more visible to others what's already happening, make it more aware and more proximate to us, because if we don't see it on a regular basis, we may not feel the compelling need to change our behaviors. So what are actions we can take now beyond what I discussed? Well, first, we need to demonstrate how people can have greater decision rights over their data. I'm not talking ownership, because if you talk to any data scientist, the word ownership of data gets very murky very fast. It's not clear if you're curating it, if you're holding it for somebody, if you're creating it. But I am saying that we each need to have greater autonomy about what's done with our data. And the answer is not, here's a 30 or 40 page in-user agreement, do you accept or not? How many people read the 30 or 40 page terms and conditions? I'm glad some people do, but I would submit most of us don't. We need to push for a much more accessible and understandable way that everybody can have a better sense. And then try to figure out, do you have a right to some of the value that's produced using your data? At least in the United States, there are some estimates that say more than $30 billion of value is created off the exchange of healthcare data. Unfortunately, none of that goes to the individual patient that actually produced the data. So there's a market that is created, but it's not benefiting the individuals that are actually the sources of it, much less did they actually opt into doing it. Because there's a belief that if you chop off the personal identifiable information, it can be sold without their knowledge. But all of us that are in data science know if you get enough data, even if it's supposedly anonymized, you can actually identify where it came from. So do you have a right to the value created in your data? Do you have a right to correct your data? How do you know if certain corporations that have collected data on you is correct, or if they reach the right correlations? I was flattered, but I was once told by a social media site that apparently I identified most with the lost generation. And if that's the case, then I've been taking some really good beauty creams. But again, do you have the ability to actually correct that data if they reach spurious correlations? And then finally, do you have the right to opt in or out of using that data to inform algorithms and AI? Or is this done without your knowledge? And I raise that because it's not just about opting out, especially for minority populations. We've already seen cases in the United States and Europe and abroad where minorities, whether you be African American or others, the machine cannot identify your face because unfortunately algorithm data sets were not representative enough. But it gets even worse because if you're not providing your data, you may actually disappear as a history of your group. And I'm thinking of Native Americans in Canada, the First Tribes. These are groups that unfortunately are not having their history and their identity and their language incorporated in the training of what's being done on even just the basic right now machine learning. And if we're not careful, it could decimate and actually within a generation have forgotten that they existed. These are issues that we need to address in the United Nations. And it's not about shaming the companies doing it. The reality is they're charting a new brave world and they don't have a textbook. It's about addressing how we can make sure people are advocating for them, and it's them themselves ideally advocating, to be present at the table and to have a choice as to what they want to do and not be exploited. 2, can we demonstrate that AI can make public health and healthcare in general more affordable? Now, I picked healthcare and public health partly because I come from that background, having done bioterrorism, but it could be almost any field. But I raise that because this is something that affects us all and affects our lives. And I think that would help overcome some of the misperceptions about what AI is, because the AI is not the Terminator, it's not Skynet. But right now, most people's information as to what AI is, it's from popular press and Hollywood. And so we have to make it real to you and show that it can benefit your life in terms of either reducing the amount of time that you have to spend on something, reducing the cost of something, or providing a better quality of care. And can you do this for underserved populations, as well as including it for mental and elder care? I'm not just talking about physical care too. Then lastly, can we demonstrate how technology can positively reframe how we work as individuals and communities? I think if history is going to look back, it'll say we spent the last 30 years leading up to 2019 creating technology that was great for corporations and great for some people, But we completely miss the neighborhood and the community part. And we're surprised where now people feel more lonely than ever. We're surprised that people are more polarized than ever. And I'm not sure necessarily this can be addressed through market-based incentives, because if the market tries to deal with communities, they may only find a way to exploit them. We've got to figure out a group that can rally around how do we uplift communities and give communities a voice and a locus of choice and how the technology helps them. But again, going back to, we used to have at least some narratives of the future. They may have been biased in some ways, they may have been Anglocentric, but at least there were some narratives about the future that were at least non-dystopian. I would ask, where are the non-dystopian narratives for 2045? And if we don't have non-dystopian narratives for 2045, don't be surprised if we create a bad future. So, having laid that all out, and getting ready for the panel that hopefully will do a much better job of uplifting your spirits that 2045 is going to be great than I did, I do want to end with one positive note. This is a photo taken in 2013 when NASA's probe Cassini turned around as it passed Saturn. And it captured a picture of that pale blue dot, known as our home. Carl Sagan said in 1994, look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, every human being you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. We're going to need more positive change agents for 2045. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.